Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Samuel Adams Returns. Those Anti-Federalists, my goodness gracious, did they ever get it right? And this is Tom Navolis, your host, and I am delighted that you are tuning in with me today and that you can see all the archives and catch up on the archived podcast at over my shoulder if you're watching at samueladamsreturns.net is where you can find everything that we have going on with Samuel Adams in relationship to this program, as well as some other interesting links and information. Today, I am going to go down a path which I talked about, oh gosh, I don't know, maybe a year ago, and that was with Dr. Witherspoon and something that he wrote that we'll get to. But what prompted the program today more than anything else is this week's constitutional classes that I'm doing and facilitating for the Institute on the Constitution, doing a class on Monday nights in one county and doing a class on Tuesday nights in another county. And the topic of this week ended up getting into both places, even though we're a little separated in the course lesson that each one is on. The topic that came up and is critical, most critical to everything that is going on, and I talked about several weeks ago that relates to, I think I talked about a little bit last week even, the religion in Washington, D.C. and America in general. You can go back and you can see there's in the videos the reference, and in the references at the website at samueladamsreturns.net, you can find that link to go listen to that program or at least read the information that's there. But the question that came up, and it's one that I know that many of you here at Liberty Works Radio Network in particular know the answer to, and but maybe not, because it was kind of a interesting catch question for those attending the class, and some are relatively politically astute. All right, Tom, quit beating around the bush. What's the question already? The question is very simplistically, can you legislate morality? Can you legislate morality? Well, the left, the socialists, communists, Marxists, all of the anti-patriot conservative people scream. I mean, literally, their head is on fire, their hair is on fire, their head's exploding. You cannot legislate morality. You just cannot do that. And I always like to ask the question, well, why do you? What? We don't legislate morality. We're just trying to make just law. Well, how do you know what just law is if you aren't establishing some mechanisms of morality? Where do you have your moral guidance to take in foist LGBTQ stuff on everybody else? Where is that from constitutionally? We're going to talk constitutionally. Where does that come about? That is a morality that's accepted under the Constitution. Well, the 14th Amendment and everything that, on equal this and equal that. Well, in totality, that's not what the 14th Amendment is all about. And it is not applied correctly, as we've talked about other times. And I'm not getting into all of that application ideas of the 14th Amendment or what's happened in the leftist portions of the Supreme Court over time with Brandeis and others, and the precedent that has been set within those courts, which as you well know, I've shown and proven in my book, From Covenant to the Present Constitution, that those court cases and the decisions within those courts were what? Immoral. Amoral at best, but immoral from the foundational perspective of what? Who wrote the Constitution? So today what I wanted to go through are some of those historical writers to help set and also establish where did the beginning of those issues that bring us to this point today, that it's okay to foist a bad theology, a bad principles, and bad history, incorrect and immoral history upon we the people. The idea of critical race theory, I mentioned that a couple programs ago as well, and that is immoral. It is immoral because it is out to continue to destroy everything that is related to Christianity, anything related to a moral substance of governance. When we look at all of the other transgender stuff, all of those other aspects of human deviance, because it's deviating from God's purposes and creation, so that's human deviance, is immoral. And there's just no other way to describe it. But let's take a look at some of the references that I wanted to talk to. And we'll start out with just a letter that Sam Adams wrote to James Warren in 1778. And he was acknowledging the receipt of two different letters that came out of June. And the context of those letters were related to what was happening in the war, what was happening in the military, and then specifically some of the happenings in the Navy, which Sam Adams was responsible for the Navy, quite frankly. He was one of the people that helped move and establish both the Marine Corps and the Navy. And in that, it was brought up about some officers. James Warren was bringing up this issue about some officers and all of their silliness, because what they were doing, they were actually putting on hold some military actions to go out and play. The frivolity of things, the occasion was just that which Sam had to reply. And this is what he said: I have long been apprehensive, that false ideas of politeness would injure the minds of our countrymen and prove destructive to morals and liberty. So his point is on this whole thing of, I guess, what is a correct language? How do you speak, or even with politeness? And he's saying that a false idea of politeness would injure the minds of our countrymen and prove destructive to morals and liberty. And then he goes on just to talk about how a lot of these instances just have caused the issues that they were seeing within the context of the military. And he goes on, I cannot, in my opinion, be supported by any principles of truth and propriety, and discovers a degree of civility shocking to sober humanity. So where's a sober humanity? What does that mean? How do you take and look at that? And yet a conduct so void of, here it is, something that is no longer common sense, will find advocates among many who never had and never can have a spark of that Republican feeling which you have always possessed. These people are formed to be asses and slaves. So if you don't have common sense, guess what? You're donkey's backside and you're going to be a slave. So let them remain so. But surely they ought not to be advanced to places of influence to spread by their examples the principles of servility and slavery among the people. So we see in a lot of areas within the context of government and in business, quite frankly, that asses and slaves take and get promoted within the context of their incompetence. And it's easy just to move them up and out and all of that, then take and chastise them and bring them into perspective of humility so that they could learn what is correctness. And that's true with what he was saying about this false sense of, of being polite. And we see that with the left all the time. They're polite in so many different ways, and I call them the left. They're the communist socialists, the godless primarily is what they are. And as a result, they get moved around, they get promoted up, but they are, in fact, themselves slaves to their own false thinking. And what that does is by moving them as examples, they then bring in the principles of servility and slavery to everybody else. So we're seeing that. Everything that I mentioned earlier on all the BLM stuff is, started out with communists. It has nothing to do about Black Lives Matter, stop abortion, especially in the black community, and their Black Lives Matter when you stop that abortion, and so on. And then when you take and you look at the whole idea of what's going on with all of these other immoral uh, pushes into society, they're there to enslave the people as well as be servile. And you know what? We just can't tolerate that. So, what we're seeing, and we'll continue to think about this as we get into the other segments, is that yes, you do legislate morality. And as so many have said, so many people that I know of personally, and what they say is that whose morality, though, will you legislate? Whose morality will you allow to be legislated? That's what we have going on. By electing the Biden administration, we've elected in, not me, but those that voted. And yes, I'm telling you, knowing the people that are working on the voter fraud, there is voter fraud. And but again, I'm not getting into all of that. The point is that's again lacking morality, allowing the slavery, the servility, the asses and slaves of their own making to take and rule and make decisions, and allowing them to be the leaders in society, having been promoted either in the political realm or in the corporate realm, or worse, owning these major corporations, these major billionaires. We've allowed all of that to happen. Not saying that people can't do things from a free enterprise, and we want people to be successful. But we've allowed the businesses, which we'll talk about in the second segment, is this whole thing of the poke and all the other joke about the Chi-Com flu and all of that, is part of allowing the immoral people to be those within government, to be those within the bureaucracies, to elect them to office. I mean, in the district I'm in here in Northeast Ohio, the guy we have in Congress is a Republican, and the guy's a joke. He's immoral. He has no guts. He has no stability of mind whatsoever to especially vote for that January 6th commission right along with all the demons. The guy has no intestinal fortitude that would sit in grounds of righteousness. So with that, I want you to come on back in the next segment as we continue to have some insights from the founders that, yeah, you will take and vote for or legislate morality. Sam Adams talked about it as well as the others. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to this second segment of Samuel Adams Returns. Those Anti-Federalists, they got it right. And I want you to take that look, as I always ask you to do. Go to Liberty Works Radio Network, look at all the hosts and hostesses, check out all the various programming that's during the week, the live programming, as well as all of us that are on during the weekend. Find those that you'd like to pay attention to. I'm glad that you're listening to me. This is Tom Navolis, your host. And again, I'm on 3 time slots on Saturdays here on Liberty Works Radio Network. So with that, go find that donate button and please go ahead and click on that, because this is a listener-funded network and you're the listeners. So help fund the network. So with that, let's talk about the morality of things. Now, good news. Good news. But I'm going to make you wait till the third segment for this good news. And it's good news here in Ohio that I think will be interesting. And I want to wait till my Screaming Eagles down there in Lima, Ohio, come back on. But when we take and we look at what it is in the question of morality and morals and all of that, just in this book, between the writings of Warren and Adams, both John and Sam, as well as Abigail and Mercy writing to all of them one way or another, there's a lot to be said in that respect on morals and law and other sundries in relationship to people and into specific issues. But the one person I wanted to mention in this segment in particular is to go back to that John Witherspoon, who, as you know, was not only a pastor, he was also the president of Princeton, and he was there for what? The Declaration of Independence. He was in Congress. He was elected to Congress during that time, and he was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. He had a few things to say in the opening of his lectures on morality and where did that sit in relationship to the law. And that's what I wanted to kind of inject at this point, is that when he was looking at morality and where does that fit, when we look even from a philosophical perspective, the first instances that he talks about is that moral philosophy, and this was from an author out of New England, he's saying that the moral philosophy is just reducing infidelity to a system. So what we have now in ethics and moral philosophy is perverse. It's just way out of understanding. And what Witherspoon was hoping in taking and looking at studying philosophy and moral philosophy and ethics in itself is that it would reduce infidelity, that meaning that of against the Christian system, to a system of itself. And you can look at then the differences of it. But however specious the objections, they will be found at the bottom, not solid. So he's going on here to say that if the scripture is true, the discoveries of reason cannot be contrary to it. So when we look at modern philosophy and modern ethics and modern, and now I guess some people call it postmodern, after modern. I don't know how you can have anything post something that's modern, but it's a nice philosophical term, and arguments to give some PhD something else to pile it higher and deeper on. But they're going here is what he's saying is that if it's contrary to scripture, it just can't be. It cannot be so. And therefore, it has nothing to fear from any quarter. And as we are certain, it can do no evil. So there is a probability that it may do much good. So he's trying to see that if you study it, especially in the concepts of scripture, that understanding reason, understanding philosophy, understanding the search of truth can only lead deeper into an understanding of what it is to be a moral man. Well, sadly, and this is the sad side of Witherspoon, is that he came from and was part of the uh, the Scottish Enlightenment in so many ways, and how that was brought into America. In fact, because he was the teacher, he was the mentor of Madison and a number of others, that influence reached into a lot of these other founders that of America. Witherspoon continues from a point is why should it not be the same with moral philosophy, that, and what he was referring to is that where is it in an interest of hurting religion? Well, we see nowadays that it does. So Witherspoon, with his understanding and context of keeping things biblical, when you're investigating these things and looking at it from that point of argument, um, it is shouldn't be anything wrong with it. And then when it comes to what that is in the law, then in the law, that this moral philosophy should be part of the law, and that there should be a moral context in law. Whoa. That's not what we're seeing. We're not seeing that moral. And again, it goes to whose morality, what morality, and what do you define that as? Where Witherspoon was defining that in the law of nature, and the idea of what is in that regular natural law and what is in the revealed law, the law of God, and how do those two work together, as well as the tradition that we have within our religious formulation. So it just gets really, really interesting, but we're seeing that that's all gone sideways. We see that it's gone sideways. We see that it's gone sideways with the likes of none other than James Wilson. James Wilson, it was of a mindset, and again, Wilson was there at the Constitutional Convention. He was there at the convention in 1776 in Pennsylvania for the state constitution as well. So he has this whole idea of what is constitutionalism, and as a Supreme Court justice, he was a person that was more of the English, or the Scottish, I should say, the Scottish moral enlightenment. And that was problematic. It was problematic because here you have now Supreme Court justice whose moral philosophy was taking on that perspective of a Scottish Enlightenment. So when I always talk about what was happening with the Constitution from the very beginning, and that when we saw it go into being exercised, then we started having problems within a year, no more than 4 years of its implementation, based on what was going on in the courts and so on. So one of the interesting aspects of Wilson in relationship to this, and as well as that going back to Witherspoon, is that when you take and you look at this philosophy, he articulated philosophy was based on a relatively optimistic view of human nature, whereas Sam Adams and the AntiFederalists, for the most part, were not. They said man was sinful. So when you have this opposing philosophical view, even at the very beginning of the country, you got a problem going on. So here you have Wilson having that view, which you hear a lot of, oh, yeah, man, they're basically good. We have a good human nature and all of that. And that human nature will win out over all things. So his personal conduct, though, in being Wilson, betrayed him. And in essence, when he actually did some adjudication, he was more pessimistic in his assessments. Madison, who was also from that school of the Scottish Moral Enlightenment, having been tutored by Witherspoon, ultimately took and rejected Wilson. He diverged from Wilson by rejecting Wilson's strong populist impulses, that being for the positive note of the people, and he submitted from that perspective, much like the Anti-Federalists, that if men were angels, there would be no need for a constitution in the first place. So Wilson he was considered to be a conservative, in which there are many conservatives today that would fit into Justice Wilson's perspective. In fact, there's many judges that would fit into that perspective of Wilson in looking at the good of man instead of taking and trying to understand that, guess what? We're sinful creatures, and therefore we need to understand that real moral perspective. So, what's allowed to happen over the last 150 years in particular is that the moralists, those that looked at humankind and human nature from that Scottish Enlightenment experience, well, you know what? LGBTQ people are good people. Okay, there can be good people, but their lifestyle and morality is immoral. Their lifestyle, what they're doing, is against the laws of nature and nature's God. And now it is being pushed because the framework of how we're adjudicating or placing law into action looks at it from a very simplified, and as Sam Adams said in the letter that I read, a bunch of asses out there that are slaves to their immorality. And then as Wilson was looking at things, okay, people are basically good. And you hear this whole stuff in a number of conservatives on this populist idea, which there's nothing wrong with the populist idea if it's within the context and framework that it was intended to be, and which a lot of we'll get into in the next segment. But what we need to understand is that when we look at the likes of Wilson, when we look at the likes of even Witherspoon, and what did that mean for them in establishing a system that would take and say, how do we make law? How do we look at law? It becomes extremely interesting. I mean, I have to say that Wilson did go along with Marshall in the fact that if a law was written and it was found to be unconstitutional under a strict understanding of the language, and even, as Wilson would know, the intent, because he was part of the arguments there during the Constitutional Convention, and he was one that persisted in looking at the direct election of the executive, the direct and proportional elections of senators, and the principle of one person, one vote. So he was a proponent of all of that. But at the same time, when you're looking outside the context and the moral context that's given through true natural law and the laws of nature and nature's God as defined biblically within what we see in nature, and then by divine revelation, that being the Bible, you're going to miss a lot. And that happened. But Sam Adams didn't miss it, nor did the Anti-Federalists. So come on back for the third segment, as we dig in some more and hear what John Adams had to say about it, as well as a little bit more on Sam Adams and what he thought, how morality applies within the political realm. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to this third segment of Samuel Adams Returns Those Anti-Federalists. They did get it right, and welcome back to all of you down there, Screaming Eagles, and where else? Lima, Ohio. So delighted to have you back as we look into, can you legislate morality? Can you legislate morality? And I reserve for you, I brought it up in the second segment, but I reserve for all of you there in Lima this little tidbit that I thought would be extremely interesting. A headline that is there in your references at samueladamsreturns.net is that Sanctuary City for Unborn Initiative spreads. Lebanon, Ohio, 29th city to outlaw abortion. The Lebanon, Ohio City Council voted Tuesday night to become a sanctuary city for the unborn, the 29th city in the nation and the first in Ohio to outlaw abortion. So go read that in the references for everyone. But yes, you can and should, as these passages and all of the references from the founding era gives us that right to legislate morality, because without morals and God's morals, so you're going to legislate morality one way or the other. You're either going to legislate morality that fits within the context of the Judeo-Christian biblical point of view, the Reformers' point of view, a Puritan's point of view, as we're going to get to here in a couple moments, or you're going to be that of the new religion in the United States, and you're going to be immoral. They have their own morality, but their own morality is the 1619 Project, the critical race theory, transgenderism, immorality, all of the other types of things, socialism, communism, destruction of Christianity. They have morality, and they have their mechanisms of doing it and what they worship, all of that. So when we get to here out of the Orators of the American Revolution, just in looking at this and just how we are in view of a general appreciation of things, there is a aspect here of political history of the country that was well written. It is vivid delineation of our early maternal and martial heroes before the whole public. All the great leaders in the various departments of statesmanship, literature, science, and arts are all in this book that is called The Orators of the American Revolution. And in here, some of the biological sketches. But something that is right at the very beginning is that, and in this preface in particular, he says that the associations which are the most affecting are moral. You got that? The most affecting areas and associations of everything that happened during the revolution are moral. The venerable monuments of the past and the localities connected are invested with irresistible attractions to a susceptible heart and cultivated mind. They snatch the soul away in rapture, as if it had been already transversed the tomb, and the bosom of immensity imbued it with the inexhaustible glories of Jehovah has diffused through the universe. Little poem here. The mind hath no horizon. It looks beyond the eye and seeks for mind. In all it sees, ever ruling. So morality was a very substance of the relationships of what was going on during that period of time. Sam Adams had this thing that he was writing in back in, oh gosh, let's see here, in 1764, and he was talking about cultivating all the virtue and public spirit and all of that. And I've brought this out to you a number of different times and quoted this, but he has to say that you have to regard the morals of the people, which are the basics of public happiness, and endeavor to have such laws made, if any are still wanting, as shall be best adapted to secure them, and that is to secure those morals for the people and their public happiness. So when he went on to say about that, and we particularly desire that you carefully look into the laws of excise, that if the virtue of the people is endangered by the multiplicity of oaths therein enjoined, or their trade and business is unreasonably impeded or embarrassed thereby, the grievance may be redressed, as the preservation of morals as well as property and rights so much depends upon the impartial distribution of justice, agreeable to good and wholesome laws. Yes, you can legislate morality. The examples go on and on. So what do we have? We have about 10 minutes, 8 minutes left. So let me go over to John Adams. And John Adams was writing on government of laws and not of men. Whoa, wait a minute. Government of laws and not of men. That's in your references. You can look it up and read it. But here we have in 1759, John Adams, he was looking at the bigger picture of things. He was realizing what that relationship between law and government is, and he strove throughout his life to gain an appreciation and understanding to how they're linked together. And what does that mean? So in his diary, he wrote this: labor to get the distinct ideas of law, right, wrong, justice, equity. Search for them in your mind. In Roman, Grecian, French, English treatises of natural, civil, common, statute law. Aim at an exact knowledge of the nature, end, and means of government. Compare the different forms of it with each other, and each of them with their effects on public and private happiness. Study Seneca, Cicero, and all other good moral writers. Good moral writers. And this is where he was going through historically, and those that were available of the time. Study Montesquieu, Vinnius, etc., and all other good civil writers, etc. There was something else that he went on to say too, and this was in the idea of legalism and what was happening in late colonial Massachusetts. John Adams began his legal practice separate from what we do in the modern day. There were no law schools realistically. Harvard had education on biblical law, on that which Blackstone was writing, as well as that Blackstone being that compilation of what was going on in English common law and what was loosely known as the English Constitution. But what he said, that there was no law schools, no formal bar associations, no requirements beyond good moral character to plead within the court. So if you wanted to be a good lawyer, you need to have good moral character. One of the things that he spoke of clearly was that the Puritans carried with them a profound respect for the rule of law as it was vested in authority. And the rule of law that was vested in authority was in the authority of God. The Puritans understood that balance. Law was not simply a man made construction, but a manifestation of God's will. It existed not merely to protect people from the aggressive tendencies of their fellow man, but also to maintain their personal morality of individuals. Maintain the personal morality of individuals. There's a historian that talks about that the authority, that is, government and law, were thought to have been made necessary by man's fall from grace, and subjugation thereto was regarded as a religious duty. So the end of law was thus seen as an accomplishment of God's will in a regenerated society bound together by a religious and political covenant. That's what it comes down to, covenant, and what that means, and how does that come to fruition. So he goes on to describe, and Adams describes that what the Puritan ministers saw professional lawyers, as Adams described them, a group that often foments more quarrels than it composes, and as potentially immoral as they defend men regardless of their innocence. That was a lot of view of attorneys. I think we still see a lot of that. We have those ambulance chasers out there and so many others that, you know, when it comes down to it, and I think we just need to wrap it up here because there's so much more in this particular writing on Adams and government law and not of men, is that when you take that whole idea of moving God outside the whole content of what it is to develop law, then you have people that are ambulance chasers. You have those that have no consideration of the moral values of ensuring that law maintains individual morality. And that was the whole biblical idea. Those were the whole arguments, the true arguments inside of Romans 13, is that the sword was given to punish evil, not that people would just subjugate themselves to it no matter what that ruler was like. And that ruler, those that we elect into office, are people that have an understanding of the sovereignty of God so that they may really do good from that moral perspective. So when we're talking about, can morality be legislated? Yeah, it sure can. But the question is always going to come down to, whose morality? Which morality? What are you going to allow? Are you going to allow the immoral to take and violate everything of the nature that God has developed? Are you going to allow it to violate everything that is true biblical principles? Well, that's what the lesser magistrates are there for, is to stop the larger insanity, as we just saw what happened in none other than Lebanon, Ohio. So, you know what? That's something that we need to pick up on. And those that believe that God is sovereign, then you need to get up and you need to act, engage with the lesser magistrates, and understand the truths that Sam Adams did. And come on back next week when we know the Anti Federalists did get it right.